Welcome to Real Solutions, a podcast series on policies for a future where everyone belongs. The Othering and Belonging Institute is hosting this podcast series with leaders from across the country to uplift and insist on bold policy solutions that would move the country towards belonging and well-being for all people.
How will you pay for that? That's the question advocates often get when proposing something our communities need, whether it's a youth center, housing for the homeless, a community crisis response service, or something else. That lack of public funding holds back all kinds of much needed solutions in communities across the country. And yet we live in the richest country in the history of the world. The money exists. It's just not going to everything and everyone it needs to. Wealth taxes are one way to pay for urgent needs, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
And of course, in order to talk about wealth tax, we have to talk about wealth inequality. And wealth inequality in the United States has risen drastically over the last 60 years plus. In 1963, the wealthiest families had 36 times the wealth of families in the middle of the wealth distribution. And by 2022, they had 71 times the wealth of families in the middle. The wealth gaps by race and ethnicity are even more stark. The tax rates paid by low income and middle class people have become higher than that of the billionaires. So now the tax burden has shifted from the upper class to the lower class.
So we're going to have two amazing speakers with us today as guests. Darien Shanske is a Martin Luther King Jr. professor of law at UC Davis School of Law. He has a PhD from UC Berkeley and a JD from Stanford. Shanske has worked on wealth tax proposals at the federal level and across many states, and has written dozens of articles related to taxation. He has a particular interest in state and local taxation and public finance and teaches on these topics.
We're also joined by Christina Livingston, who is the executive director of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, also known as ACE. She has been organizing since 2004 and has worked on campaigns that address equitable infrastructure investment, progressive revenue solutions, housing equity, access to high quality and well-funded public services, corporate accountability, good government, representative voter engagement, and criminal justice. She centers her work from the intersection of racial and economic impacts and is passionate about uplifting the voices of people of color, poor folks, and women. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this episode on wealth tax. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Solutions, the podcast where we discuss policies for a future where everyone belongs. Excited for all of you who are joining us, whether you are listening to us on your morning commute, while you're having coffee, or while you're just washing the dishes at home. I hope you enjoy this episode. My name is Jose Richard Aviles, and I'm one of the co-hosts of this podcast.
And I'm Eli Moore, your other co-host. Welcome. Thank you for being here, listening in. We have two amazing guests today to talk about wealth taxes, Darien Shanske and Christina Livingston. And they're going to help us understand what are wealth taxes, what difference would they make in people's lives, and what does it look like to advance wealth taxes, and what would it mean? So let's get into that. What are wealth taxes? How do they work? And what is their definition?
The income tax, which again, most of your viewers will be familiar with, is a flow, right? How much did you make this year? There might be reason you made more or less. There are also other complications, but we just say, give us a snapshot. This is the best we can do. You earned this much this year. We're going to run it through the tax rates, and you're going to pay taxes on that. It's a little more complicated, but that's the basic idea. Property tax is a stock, right? And the wealth tax most people are familiar with is their tax on real property. And there we don't ask you, we ask, what is your home worth, right? You own this home. You have title to this home. How much is it worth? We're going to apply a tax rate, usually 1, to that amount, and you'll pay that. And typically, though people by no means do they like property taxes, they do have a certain logic that a lot of people accept, right? So to the extent that local property taxes get spent in local communities, people understand, even if they don't like them, and obviously so they really don't like them if they're rising fast because of inflation. That's a whole other story. But they understand that tax is going to their community, and asking somebody who has a greater stock of wealth to make a bigger contribution because of their bigger stake in real property makes sense to people. A wealth tax, or the kind of wealth tax we're talking about, is exactly the same thing. It just says, don't just tell us about the value of your house. It's the end of the year. you got a statement from your broker about the value of your intangible assets, so your stocks and your bonds. Tell us what that piece of paper says too. And for a lot of people, that answer is nothing. But if you're really wealthy, that answer is going to be a big number. And we just want to take the same low kind of rate, it could be slightly different depending on design questions, but say 1% times whatever your broker says you owe. We're just going to say, or you own 1% times the $1 billion of stock. And now we just want you to pay $10 million. And $10 million, of course, is a lot, but it's only 1% of the billion. And to keep just in terms of make sure we understand the full context, in general, somebody lucky enough to have $1 billion is probably earning 7.5% return every year. So we're actually they're still getting richer, even if we have them pay 1%. One might quibble with that as a policy matter, right? That if you think the great fortunes are an issue, a low tax, which doesn't actually keep them from becoming even bigger, isn't big enough. And we can bracket that to one side, but the actual live proposals would all just tax a fraction of just the growth in the great fortune. And the idea would be, you self-assess based on what your brokers say. Maybe you pay once a year with your income tax, and then you'd be subject to an audit sometime afterwards. And it would only be for people, as in the current proposal, who are billionaires, or other proposals we've worked on, 100 millionaires, people with huge resources, right? So the vast majority of people who don't have that much wealth and don't have that much sophistication would not be subject to this tax. And that just, I want to emphasize that every proposal I've been involved with only dealt with people with a lot of resources. It doesn't make a lot of sense as a policy or justice matter to move down the chain to even upper middle class people.
It'd be fun to do a little bit of imagining, right? So can we imagine a future of good living where there was enough funding for all of the services, infrastructure, and resources that communities across the country need to live in a dignified lives with well-being? Christine, I'm curious, in your opinion, what would that look like? What would it may feel like for someone living in that future?
I actually really love imagining the future that I and others are working so hard to create, and obviously there's no one answer, there's no correct answer to this question. So for anyone who is listening, I really encourage you to take a moment yourself to imagine this future, because what it is that we're fighting for is what keeps us in the struggle when things get hard or when they seem impossible. And the thing I always want to remember is that since this society was built by people, it can be rebuilt by people. So it's such a worthwhile activity. When I look into the future, I see a descendant of mine, a grandchild, maybe a granddaughter, who's waking up in a green, affordable home that's part of a community land trust. And she wakes up, she brushes her teeth with clean water, she's eating food that's grown by state-funded farmers who receive fair pay for their labor. She kisses her parents and she hops on the bus and she goes to her neighborhood school that provides a first-class education. And after school, she visits a doctor that she loves, who she's been seeing her whole life, for a well check. And while she and her parents are there, they pick up the grandparents' life-saving heart medication that's free of charge because it's paid through Medicare for all. And then her parents drive her on well-maintained roads to some public park so she can, hang out with her friends. And then at the end of the day, she falls asleep with a full stomach and she's feeling safe and she's feeling cared for. And this is not happening in the Hollywood Hills. And this is not happening in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's happening deep in the heart of South LA, or in Flint, Michigan, or in Jackson, Mississippi, or name your favorite community that's traditionally underinvested in, right? That's where she's experiencing this life. And her parents, just like so many parents right now, will work hard, obviously, to provide a life for her and care for her and show her love and to create opportunities for her. But their burden will be significantly lighter than the burden that many are bearing today, because the government that I'm imagining will be a government of care, and one that provides quality infrastructure and systems and programs that help everyone enjoy a dignified life. And that baseline level of support that the government provides is funded through a progressive tax structure that doesn't allow a small number of people to amass staggering wealth while everyone else is struggling through poverty. So in some ways, my vision for this future is actually really simple. And in other ways, it seems really unrealistic because of what we've been living in. But again, I want to actually remind you that some kids right now, today, are living a version of that life. So it's obviously possible. But in order for us to get to what I'm imagining, we have to address the wealth gap in this country, and we have to build the political momentum for progressive taxation and wealth taxes, amongst other things.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Christina. You painted that picture so vividly, tangibly. We often hear there's just not money for that. There's this kind of scarcity mentality. And I wonder if you could, from your point of view, talk about some of the things that are needed right now, but that we're hearing, oh, there's not money for that. There's just not resources. And what are some of those investments that are so needed?
Obviously, there's so much deep need that people are experiencing right now. Right now in California, there are nearly 200,000 unhoused folks. That's a quarter of the homelessness population in the United States. And a significant cause for that number is the staggering amount of rent or other housing costs that people are being asked to pay. The state right now needs to create 1 million affordable homes, and that means homes that are actually affordable to the third of California workers who are low-wage workers, and to limited income residents in the state. But there's very little funding dedicated to it. So this kind of resourcing could really help on that front. There are up to 3.4 million Californians right now who could lose Medi-Cal coverage, and potentially millions more in the individual marketplace who will face significant premium increases or lose coverage entirely when the 2026 cuts come into play. Coupled with an estimated almost 400,000 to 1 million Californians who might lose SNAP, CalFresh benefits. So like in the hierarchy of needs, if we're talking about food and shelter and health, those rank pretty high. And if people can't secure those basic needs, they face significant challenges to living a successful and dignified life, right? But all three of those needs can be provided by the government with funding. And there's more than enough wealth in this state, let alone in the country, to provide people what they need on those fronts. So there's the money and there are the needs. And if we can marry them, we can provide, a much better place for people to be living.
You started talking about the basic needs, right? Food, housing. Clearly, there's this interconnection that happens. Can you talk a little bit about how this sort of scarcity in which we're kind of living in now how does it ripple out to affect others and sort of at a systemic level?
The hardest hit folks are obviously low-income people, low-income families, those on fixed incomes, people who can't afford like private insurance or, the high cost of rent or groceries or gasoline. Those are the folks that are most hard hit. And, a lot of those folks work, but their employers don't provide them neither the wages nor the coverage that they need. We're talking about young adults that are new to the workforce. We're talking about seniors. We're talking about women who have escaped domestic violence. We're talking about children, veterans, disabled people. And of course, we all know that like when you add the race layer, that Indigenous, Latinx, Black people are disproportionately impacted. Even when we look at the raw numbers, we know that more white Americans are impacted than any other race. And I would just say that there's none of us that doesn't know a senior, a disabled person, a young person new to the workforce, a youth who is going to school but is homeless. Like that actually touches all of us. Even in, the highest income neighborhoods, we are connected to one another. So we all know people who are deeply affected. And when those folks aren't doing well, that actually does certainly ripple out to everybody not doing well.
And just to add a little bit to that, for one thing, doing things the right way in lots of cases does require paying more, but in lots of cases actually requires paying less. So for example, giving somebody good preventive health care is much cheaper than waiting for them to have an untreated chronic condition. And so if at the same with helping somebody with a little bit of rent support to keep them in a home is much cheaper than having them fall into the unhoused population and now have to deal with all that. And so a lot of the scary numbers are like, oh, there are 200,000 unhoused people. They each need tens of thousands of dollars to get them into a home. Well, that number is we only have to face that number because of a whole series of really bad choices we made to create this situation to begin with. Bad moral choices, but also bad economic choices. It would have been much cheaper to just do the right thing to start with. Furthermore, this question of whether we can afford it is pretty easy to demonstrate that we can. So, for example, we just cut, right, as part of the HR1, the Big Beautiful Bill Act, it's called, not for its moral qualities. We're throwing these millions of people off the rolls, and so they're losing preventive care. And why are we doing it? Are we facing some dramatic fiscal crisis such that it made any sense to do it? Could we not afford to keep those people on the rolls? And of course, manifestly, we could, right? We only did that in order to provide tax cuts to people who don't need them. And could we then go a step further and provide even more people decent health care? Well, European social democracies do it all the time. It's clearly possible. It's just a question of how we allocate our resources. So it's not, at some point there are limits, of course, but we're nowhere near that world. Right? It'll be very easy to pay for these very low cost things that would really improve people's lives.
Darien, tell us a little bit more about your take on why the current tax system really fails to provide enough resources and produces these inequities.
That's a long story, and I don't think your listeners want a lullaby. So let me try to keep it brief. At the federal level, we all know the federal government levies an income tax. That is the primary way the federal government funds itself. That income tax is somewhat progressive. However, a couple of things. It is a lot less progressive, will be than it has been on account of a series of cuts made by the first and now second Trump administration. It doesn't raise enough money to do some of the things that need to be done. And because of its structure, it only taxes income, which you might say for most of our listeners, well, sure, there's a lot of income about, but income is actually not something, at least in some forms or traditional forms, that very rich people have. If I earn a salary, it's income. I don't know, buy a stock and sell it and make money, it's income. But if I'm really, really, really wealthy, then I don't have to sell my stock ever. I can borrow against it to do whatever I want. And you might say, well, sure, if you borrow against your stock, isn't that income? You're using it, you're using the benefit. And there's an argument for that. But the federal income tax and the state income tax systems do not consider borrowing to be income. So people who are really wealthy enough, they don't have to sell their assets in order to live a really good life. They're not subject to the federal income tax, and they're not subject to the state income tax either, which piggybacks on that. So we don't raise enough money, and we don't raise very much money from the tippy top, even for taxes that are relatively progressive. Now, I should explain what a progressive tax is. A progressive tax asks people who have more to pay a bit more. So if you're at the very top of the ladder, the federal system, you pay 37%. The California system, you pay about 13%. If you're further down the ladder, you might pay 20% on your income or 10% or nothing. And that is a progressive tax. States typically rely, not the federal government, on two other taxes that don't have this structure, at least not in the same way. Right? Sales taxes, say about 8% in California or 9% depending on where you are, right? That's the same. It does. The cashier doesn't say, well, how much do you earn? It's only a 5% sales tax, right? Everybody pays 9%. And the less well off you are, the more likely you're to spend every penny you earn on something and pay sales tax on something. And so the sales tax, though not entirely a regressive tax, is relatively regressive because the rate is the same for everyone. And it applies to most of what poor people spend money on, or more of their income. We also have the property tax, which is primarily a local tax. And the property tax also is just basically one rate. In California, it's 1%. It's not really based on your income. Of course, the value of your home is least correlated to your income in many cases, though not perfectly. So it's 1% times the value of your home. And so if you inherit a home that's a lot more relative to your income, or your home was appreciated relative to when you bought it, the property tax doesn't care. It's just 1% times that stock of value. But the property tax, at least has been in the United States since 1930, only applies to real property. So most people who have wealth in this country have wealth in the form of homes, of real property. And every place in this country, that wealth is taxed. If you're lucky enough that you have wealth in the form of something other than real property, say a lot of stock, that wealth is not taxed. It would have been in 1930, but it's not now. And so the wealth tax is a tax on the very wealthy on assets that are neither taxed by the property tax nor the income tax because of the structure of those taxes.
Certainly part of the reason that we don't have the revenue that we need is because of the structure of taxes right now. But just as I was talking about people create society and can recreate society, people create the tax codes. There are decision makers who are deciding to or not to pass, wealth tax measures that would bring more money into the state or the country. And so the problem is structural, but it's also about political will. But when we think about who it is making those decisions, oftentimes these are not initiatives being put before us on the ballot. These are, discussions being had with legislators, decision makers that have been elected. And because of the overwhelming amount of money in politics, normally we are finding that these are folks who want to get reelected. Therefore, they want to follow the agenda of whoever it is that's giving them, campaign donations, et cetera, which tend to be wealthy folks. So, I just want to put up the reality that there are real people making the decisions around this, and that we have to affect what is the cost benefit analysis of those decision makers in terms of people power versus organized money in order to create the political reality that would support wealth taxes.
Thank you for adding that, Christina. It's very important to also mention that, right, that there are still people behind this, that it's not. And also thank you, Darien, for pointing out that there is a pre-post 1930 situation, right? There's a series of values, right, and thoughts that underlie the current structure. And I'm wondering if you can both share a little bit to what do you think some of those values are. And interestingly enough, I'm just going to point out that by the time this episode comes out, the amount of funding and money in politics that's being paid out has come up in every episode. And so that's been quite an interesting thing to note. And I mean, I have my own little theories, but y'all need to wait to listen to the last episode for that one. But again, going back to the question, if you can talk a little bit about some of the underlying values and thinking that's behind these current systems.
Coming up in organizing, someone, I can't even remember who it was who said this to me, and it was said to me, I don't know, 2 decades ago, and has stuck with me. California used to be number one in education, right? We had a really robust system of funding our services here. And what they said was, as the state got less white, the revenue, the openness to fund public services decreased. So there's actually a lot of racism underlying, the values of the tax structures that we currently are, living in. There's also the story that we tell ourselves in the United States about rugged individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which means that if you have something, you've earned it, right? There's a meritocracy. And if you don't have something, that's what you earned. You should not be having your hand out expecting me to pay for you, right? There's that story that we hear. And it was a story intentionally created. I think people know that story, but they also hold in their own value systems, values around interconnectedness and caring for your neighbor. The less they see someone as their neighbor, maybe the less we think about like that relationship. But a lot of us are carrying some cognitive dissonance between the story of the United States and the story that we're told about ourselves as good people. And those come into conflict in these sort of tax structures. So I would just say, in the regressive tax structures, it's sort of wealthy people deserve to be wealthy. They've earned their wealth, and we should not tax them and make them want to leave the state. And we should not, punish them for being successful, instead of recognizing that, in fact, in many cases, this is not, maybe in every case, no one individually becomes wealthy. Either you had money passed down to you from your family, or you benefited from a lot of the public structures and systems that, you don't have to pay for to get to where you are. So we've all actually contributed to wealthy people becoming wealthy, and wealthy people should in turn contribute to making sure that all of us are as, our well-being is good, and that we are able to live dignified lives.
I agree with that. So I just want to start by just amplifying that there are big public things we have done, the aqueduct, the UC system, that were tremendous acts of faith and investment that have, truly paid off. And so there are various reasons, I think, including racism, why our historical imagination has become stunted. But it doesn't change the fact that it's become stunted and that we should be more creative. And that we've done it not so long ago. I mean, the Master Plan for Education, the creation of the UCs, right, that didn't happen so long ago that we should be unable to muster that. Again, in the narrower tax world, I would point out that we used to just have property taxes. And one of the reasons we have income taxes starting in the early 20th century is this understanding that if we're going to tax people on ability to pay and have a fair, more robust community and government, we couldn't just use property taxes, because the relationship, in an agrarian society, a property tax could capture a lot of what we wanted to capture. But in an industrial society where lots of people had wealth that was not real property, we needed to move to a different kind of tax system. And so the income tax system, as originally designed, was trying to create this more perfect community. And so one way to think about where we're at is that this rule, for instance, about borrowing or about you only pay income tax on sale of things, it just wasn't that important in 1916. The question is now in 2025, will we have the imagination to look back at what we were trying to do in the early 20th century, to have these progressive levies in order to have a decent government, in order to and close these loopholes and fix them. And it turns out that wealth taxes are quite plausibly a big part of that mix.
I'm curious, so where does the wealth tax come from? Where is it adopted from? It clearly doesn't sound like an American thing just yet.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I know this is the other part of the Othering Institute, so I want to defend the wealth tax as not other, right? So the key thing is, for 100 years, we had something called the general property tax in the United States, and it only went out of fashion partially in the 1930s on the theory, at least largely on the theory, that the income tax was progressive enough and doing its job. But it's not. But so saying we should go back to the general property tax is saying we should go back to an old American idea that we used to have. If in terms of cool foreign stuff, other countries, Switzerland still has a tax like this that it imposed, I'm pretty sure, starting in the 1930s at the canton, so at the subnational level, and it's still there. And it works pretty well. Is it perfect? Are the designs that I've worked on exactly the same as the Swiss? No, but they're pretty similar, and they answer some of the core problems that people will talk about, or challenges. They'll say, well, it's a private business, I don't have shares, it's hard to say how much it's worth. Well, Switzerland has a formula. They say how much you're telling your accountant you earned, and that's what the current billionaire tax proposal has as well. Again, one can quibble if it's the right formula or change, right? But the idea is these are soluble problems. And in public policy, as you know, we don't look for the perfect. We look for the pretty good. And so if there's right now, for these great fortunes, we're essentially taxing them in many cases at zero. And so the idea that we're not going to go for 50% because it's not 100%, I don't think that's a logical position.
And listen, just for full disclosure, the audience members, I feel like at this point know that I'm a big Beyonce fan. Listen, Beyonce should be getting taxed too, and she would be okay with it. But I'm curious. You mentioned Switzerland. Are there any other foreign examples that you can think of that have applied similar models, and how are they working out?
Great. Well, we talked in our paper about similar taxes in Spain and Norway. Opponents of this tax will talk about a similar tax in France that apparently did not go as well as they had hoped, but a lot has to do with the design. Our contention is that if you create a tax that's really easy to evade, people will do it. These are rich, sophisticated people. They don't like paying taxes. They'll do it. If it's not, our feeling is that one of the perks, and again, I don't know from experience, but I presume that one of the perks of being a billionaire, we can ask Beyonce, is that you get to live where you want. And we talked about how these taxes are smaller than the amount of your annual appreciation. They're way smaller than the swerves of your stock portfolio week to week. And so the idea that you're going to move from the place where you want to live, and we think the evidence from Spain, Norway, and Switzerland bear that out. Not that nobody responds and not that nobody cares, but just that most people don't. And to the extent they respond, it's with paper transactions that we try to deal with the model that we're currently advancing.
Let's talk about what difference it would make, what type of money it would generate if a wealth tax was applied in a state in the United States or across the country.
A lot has to do with the design and the rate. The answer is potentially quite a lot. And the reason for that, of course, is for the explosion in income inequality. And, we worked at this last proposal with Professor Manuel Saez at Berkeley, who's really one of the big experts right in this area. And he pointed out, that the wealth of California billionaires has increased way beyond the rate of inflation or any other kind of investment, over these last decades or so. So at this point, I think it was something like $2 trillion is what the 200 billionaires in California are worth. And so therefore, the proposal is to impose a 5% tax on them, sort of payable over 5 years. So essentially, in lots of ways, 1%. 5% times 2 trillion, right? That's 100 billion, 20 billion a year. Now, how much is that in the real world? Even in California, right? That's not nothing, 20 billion a year. Well, if you think about this sort of really crushing cuts that are proposed to the Medicaid program, this tax was designed and would largely mitigate that disaster. So that's one way to sense to the scale. Now, you might say, yeah, but that's kind of a shame, because last year we were able to pay for all this out of the federal income tax without a problem. And so it's a shame that we need to use this tax to backfill. That's true. It is a shame. I'm just offering a sense of the scale. So imagine the federal government hadn't gone rogue and decided to cut the most vulnerable people off, and we had 20 billion more a year. Could we really provide quality healthcare to a big percentage of the people who still don't have health insurance? Or could we really spur a boom in affordable housing or deal with a lot of wildfire prevention? Like, we have lots of needs. The answer is yeah, it would go a long way towards those things.
We've calculated that if we want to build the scale of affordable housing that I was mentioning in California, we would need 20 billion a year. That closes that gap entirely. We could house all of us for that amount of money. We could provide tuition-free college in California for a mere 3 billion a year, right? The world could be very different if we are taking in that amount of money. But to my earlier point about the political consciousness of this all, taxing the wealth alone, that's not the only option. And that by itself is not going to be enough to create the vision I described, right? It could fill one huge hole. But I think if we are politically ready for wealth taxes, right? If the public consciousness and legislative bodies are ready to embrace that, if the like Overton window encompasses real wealth taxes, I have to imagine that we're also in a place where we're ready to talk about other complementary measures, like using pension funds for public good and how we're taxing corporations and corporate wealth. Like maybe I'm sure that those are all topics for their own webinar series that we could talk about. But part of this is if we can actually create the public will and consciousness to get here, we're in a very different place concerning what's possible for us.
I would love to come back and talk about corporate taxes. You might not want me to do that. But in any event, I do want to say that if you look at some of the countries, say in Northern Europe, that do provide, truly, far superior social service systems than we do. And a lot of those cases, yes, they probably have some more progressive taxes to some extent, but they also have value-added taxes, which are sales taxes, and they are by most accounts way or relatively regressive. And they're levied at way higher rates than our sales taxes. So if anybody visited Europe, you pay 22% in VAT, right? Our sales tax account, it's what, right? And they levy the value-added tax on way more goods and services than we do on the sales tax. And so you might say, wow, so they have a 22% tax that applies to much more. That's pretty regressive, and it is. But no one would say, therefore, it's terrible to be poor in Denmark, right? And the reason nobody says that is because you take that 22% and a big chunk of that money now goes back to free healthcare, free dental care, housing subsidies, things like that, that make it a decent place to live. And so I just want to emphasize what Christina's saying is that, yes, I think we should have wealth taxes, but also if we had a different kind of social consciousness, we could have relatively regressive taxes, even at a much higher level, if we spent them progressively, right, as part of a public finance system that actually served people. And so it's true, wealth taxes don't have to do everything. They can't do everything. They could be a part of the transformation.
In addition to this being, a podcast around policy solutions, what's also starting to come up is that we need a cultural shift behind each of these policy solutions. So as much as there is public policy organizing that needs to happen, there has to be a cultural shift. But I'm curious to think about what are some of the underlying values that we've talked about, or what would that cultural shift need to happen in order for us to really sort of adopt as a society something like a wealth tax?
The thing that you're pointing to right now is like this scarcity mindset that we've all been spoon-fed. That, in fact, if you take something from me, even if I have so much, you're going to take all of it from me. And then there's nothing for me. And I cannot allow that. There's like on top of the rugged individualism and meritocracy, there's that, wealth scarcity of scarcity mentality that people have. I think what this is reminding me of is, we require restructuring about how we think about the economy, right? Like I've been talking with Professor Manny Pastor, who is at the USC Equity Research Institute, right? And he's been talking a lot recently about solidarity economics, which is a frame that really recognizes that people are not just individuals, but they're also members of broader social groups and communities, right? And that we're actually not just motivated by our self-interest. That is a primary motivator, obviously, for most people, but that we also, have a desire to care for one another and to belong, right, in a group together. And that we should and we can actually build an economy that doesn't just embrace individuality and competition, but actually gives us like a sense of our shared destiny. And our tax system should really follow that same framework, right? The values beneath a wealth tax follow that framework. We're looking to create a tax system that not only like values collectivity, but also equity, like a system that can pay for the care and dignity that we all require, and that values giving from what we have to those in need so that we are all in a better place.
Yeah, I think our interdependence is underappreciated. You even think about like the barista serving the espresso to the billionaire in the morning, or the person vacuuming that office, in the middle of the night when everybody else is gone, or the Uber or Lyft driver who took them to the airport. Like, all those people were instrumental in that person being successful that day and making their next 10 million or billion. But none of them are being considered for the value they're bringing, the contributions they're making, and getting to share in the benefits. And so I think some of it is just like us being more conscious of that interdependence and valuing it. And it's just kind of human decency too. I think there are values in this country around doing right by others and valuing each other, and just having basic human decency that are also part of what informs a policy like this. So I don't think it's always as far off or as radical as sometimes we think. We've been, I think, really like kind of celebrating the value and the promise of a wealth tax. Let's also recognize some of the concerns or critiques that come up around this policy and talk about what we think of them and if there's how you would respond to them.
One classic or objection is that all the billionaires would leave. And there are a couple of responses to that. I mean, one response is, it's not monopoly. It's not like we're trying to win by having more billionaires than anybody else. Like, so there's a fundamental question about what exactly we're doing. If 5 billionaires leave, it's not like So there's like question of like why are their choices about location and so very important. And then on top of that, there's a common sense question or position that's been supported by empirical research that, like, in general, very rich people are actually less likely to move because, again, the really cool thing about being really rich is you get to live where you want. And so the idea that you might complain about it and loudly, but the idea that you'd actually leave. And so typically, to the extent California increased the highest rates on personal income tax earners, or Massachusetts recently imposed a millionaire's tax. These taxes, everyone was like, oh, it's going to destroy the economy. Everybody's going to leave. And again, maybe a handful of people really did leave and really did leave loudly. But these taxes have actually raised more money than projected, just like including in California. So in fact, most people stayed and the economy wasn't destroyed. In fact, it was so vibrant, right, it created more millionaires who actually pay the tax. So the objection is, right, that people are going to leave and somehow their leaving will lead to all these this economic disaster. And the response is probably for the most part they're not. And secondly, it's not going to lead to economic disaster if they do, because the rest of the economy is still going to hum along and create more millionaires. Well, that's the primary thing that people talk about. The other thing, just to note about the tax currently that might be on the ballot in November, is to understand it's a one-time tax. And it's a one-time tax specifically on the theory that even though many people who helped work on it are skeptical of these mobility arguments, we realize they do definitely have a certain political trenchantcy. And so we can say, but it's a one-time tax. And the measurement date, will have happened already. So you don't get any benefit from moving. Again, I don't actually think it's a really deep problem, but to the extent people are concerned about it, we've tried to address it by designing the tax to reduce that incentive.
In some ways, these critiques just don't even pass the BS meter. It's sort of like, if you put a cap on rent, it's going to make housing unaffordable. If you tax billionaires, it's going to ruin the economy. Like, it's like, what are you talking about? You're saying the exact opposite of what it's going to, like, that we just know it's going to do. But what happens is everyday people are like, no, that makes sense. We should do rent control and then housing will be affordable, or we should do a billionaire's tax and then the economy will be better. And then some economist puts out something that says, no, and here's why. And we're all like, oh no, I'm not an economist. I must just not know something. But like, that's not true. Like, like we have more wisdom in ourselves than we understand. We are living in this economy, living with these structures all the time. So I think part of what we have to do is, there are going to be conflicting arguments, but mostly arguments, just like in statistics, they're all made to support a particular viewpoint. So we've got to like get people to recognize like their own wisdom and to kind of go with their gut on these kinds of things, to trust in themselves, so that we can overcome the misinformation that will always come in around these kinds of political discussions.
I just want to just build on that, because the empirical evidence totally bears Christina out, right? So to the extent fancy economists are able to show that there's been some effect to these, not wealth taxes, because they're not, or at least not in this country, but other sort of progressive tax measures, and show, oh yeah, a few people left or a few people did things. There are two things to note. First of all, those effects might be big enough to be measurable, but they're so small that a state like California, Massachusetts still made much more money than expected. So just showing that it happened, and it's statistically valid that it happened, doesn't show that it was so big that it wasn't really worth doing. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, to the extent these studies do show effects, they tend in general not to show that people moved, but that they formed a trust. They did something on paper, so they still got to live in Malibu, but they got their money protected. And so the question, because they don't really want to leave Malibu, and so the question is, how do we keep them from just signing a piece of paper and pay less in taxes? Because that's not nearly as big a deal. And again, part of our proposal is to try to make it harder to do that. Right now, the system is porous. It's not a hard thing to do, but that's just a question, again, we make as a society, not to invest the time to make the laws a little bit more rigorous, so that it's not so easy to just, shift your money to a different jurisdiction.
I'm curious, we started talking about this a little bit earlier. Christina, you started pointing out that the wealth tax in itself is just not enough. And I'm curious if you could start talking a little bit about, to actualize that imagining that you opened up this episode with, what are some of the complementary policies that are needed to actualize that future?
This is true of most policies. If you are going to implement a policy in a colorblind way, it will perpetuate the kind of built-in racism that exists in the structure. So if we are just saying, oh, let's just get more money for California or for Los Angeles or for Indiana or wherever we are, and we have no say over how that money gets spent, it is very likely that that money will be spent in ways that our communities do not support, or that just will not benefit. Maybe they would support it, but it's not getting to them. It won't benefit them. So I think a lot about, local control funding formulas in California, where school districts are getting funding based on, the school sites get different amounts of money based on the need of those school sites, based on the need of those communities, so that more vulnerable folks have more money allocated, dedicated to them. So that kind of, making sure that the funding addresses the need in the place where you are is going to be important. And obviously, people have a lot of mistrust about the government's ability to provide for them. So even in crafting policy, if we sort of leave it open to general funds, it is less attractive to people for the reasons that I'm talking about. So, really thinking about the how it's spent, those pieces, can we bake them in? I want to just say it will be a real fight to be able to pass a wealth tax, but the fight won't end there. We will have to continue our advocacy around, budgeting every year, where it goes, where it shouldn't go. This is not wave a wand. This is not you get to win the thing and walk away. Organizing and working for our people is like lifelong work. So you got to buckle up and stay in the ride.
Thanks, Christina. So can you continue down that road and talk about what it looks like to organize to make something like a wealth tax a reality?
I think organizing for something like a wealth tax is not so unlike organizing for anything else. People will move into action if they have an identified self-interest or collective interest that they feel called to. They will stay in the fight if they can see some wins along the way, because sometimes these are very long fights that we're in. And it's important to recognize on the front end that there will be strong, powerful, moneyed opposition to this kind of effort. And in my organizing world, what I know is you have to build the power on your side to contest against the power on someone else's side. And most of our folks don't have a lot of influence and access and money. Some of the folks on our side do, right? Unions do to some extent, not to the scale of billionaires, but what we generally though try to rely on is, can we build the people power in various like levels of government and various right to be able to contest. And we've seen over and over again that actually we're like David and Goliath fights, we can win those. Eli and Richmond, I'm thinking about like Chevron versus the people. Like we're able to win some of those fights. And sometimes it's not even that hard to win them because enough of the consciousness in that place has shifted so that people understand the Chevron agenda is not the agenda that's going to benefit me and my family and my neighbors, my community, etc. So, but we do have to start with organizing people, real people that will really benefit on the back end. And we have to organize a lot of them. Together, we have to do what we did at the top of this call. We need to co-design a vision together about what we are fighting for, what we are motivated to fight for, right? Why would we do this? Why should we, take on this fight? What is it going to fund? And then we have to organize our allies. A lot of us really think of ourselves in silos. I want to get my piece of the funding to pay for this particular thing. If you're fighting for another piece of funding, that's going to make it harder to win my thing. Maybe I want to try to slow you down. So we actually need some alignment and raise enough money so that more of us actually, I don't want to fight over pieces of the pie. Let's just make the pie bigger. And we really have to sort of create some broad alignment around the concept, the timing, the campaigning, so that we're not fighting one another. Then we have to organize the decision makers and we have to take action and stay the course, right? The thing is, this is it's sort of, like I said before, both simple and very hard. But the thing about organizers are optimists by trade, right? We really believe in the power of everyday people. We really believe that if we stand up together and keep pushing, we can win. I've seen it happen over and over at small scales, at big scales. And I just want to remind people that what we are in right now is the most transformative moment any of us have lived through. There is more possibility right now than has really been, accessible to any of us in our lifetimes. Now, a lot of that possibility is being borne out by people who are damaging us. But as things are being torn down, we have the opportunity to build something else up. And sometimes in moments, you can pass something, you can win something that it took decades and decades of getting a bunch of slapdowns and no's to get to this point where we can get to a yes. So I would just say the organizing looks like every other organizing, but we have to believe and we have to do, some amount of work to align ourselves and prioritize this in this moment where people are open to the concept.
I am a little sad that we're arriving towards the end of the episode. I've learned a lot today. I'm excited. I'm optimistic. And I'm also going to leave a little bit angry, but I think for good reasons.
Let's just finish with what's one thing you really would like people to take away from this conversation. We've touched on a lot of different questions and issues. What would you like to end with and emphasize?
My basic point is there's more than enough wealth to cover all of our basic needs. Our tax system, our economy, our communities, they can all be structured in ways that reduce disparities, that reduce the wealth gap, that show, that we value the collective, but it's up to us to fight for it. So just always remember, people are powerful. You are powerful. We are powerful, and that we can win for one another.
I guess I'd end with two ideas, somewhat in tension with another. I mean, one is relatedly that we can do big things. Right? We built the aqueducts, we built the UC. We don't have to just passively let our collective investments in infrastructure and other services just collapse for no reason. But that when it comes to wealth taxes, the sort of legal technology of how to do this is largely 100 years old. And I want to emphasize that it's not scary, not novel. It's super boring. I like it. You don't have to. It's fine. But you're not being asked to sign on to something really strange or novel. It's basically a Back to the Future kind of proposal in order to help deal with current emergencies.
Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of the Real Solutions podcast. We hope that you at least got inspired with some organizing strategies to begin to shift tax burden off of low income and middle class families and onto the billionaires. Let's talk about that, Mam Dani. Don't add that.